Good afternoon. I'm Garth Ruff, Beef Cattle Field Specialist here at Ohio State University Extension. And today we're going to talk about baleage as a stored forage option for sheep. So I want you to think back, if you're at the 2019 Buckeye Shepherd Symposium, to this picture on this slide, where we had a presenter talk about feeding baleage to sheep, which brought up some questions. What exactly is baleage? How do we correctly make baleage? What ways can we feed it? And is it ultimately a safe forage for sheep? All right. And I think a couple different things, the idea of wrapping the forage, certainly the mold in this picture is what brought up those questions. A lot of good information in this presentation as far as the literature, different research projects that summarize making baleage and proper preservation and fermentation. Feel free to check those out at your own leisure after today. So what is baleage? Well, when we're making baleage, we're combining the processes of ensiling with making somewhat dry hay, right? Hay that has an ideal moisture content. It's drier than silage. We're somewhere in 40 or 60% moisture. We're going to wrap that product in plastic and hopefully produce a highly palatable fermented forage. And typically we're going to do this into a large round or a large square bale, which may present some limitations based on our flock size and feed out. In our home flock and herd, I'll just tell you right now, when we got into the sheep business 3 or 4 years ago, we had to learn how to feed baleage to sheep because it was all we had given weather challenges of that particular year. But we've made the best of it. We've learned some along the way, especially in terms of bunk life and overall stability once we unwrap that baleage. And I'll touch more on that as we go throughout this presentation. So why consider baleage? Well, just like we've done in our home operation, to minimize the rain disruptions and weather challenges of making dry hay. Think back the last 3 to 5 years, especially for first cutting hay, the challenges in terms of rainfall and wet springs that we've had. By making baleage, it allows us to cut earlier in the season and to bale that forage sooner after mowing. It doesn't take 3 days to dry baleage. We want to dry to a certain point where we'll have a stable product and then go ahead with the process. We have improved forage quality. We have less leaf loss compared to baling dry hay when we bale, and really 45 to 65% moisture, give or take, versus dry hay in that 15 to 20% moisture range. And we have reduced respiration losses. We lose fewer plant sugars because we're not letting that product dry down. We're going to increase palatability and less feed loss because of it. And we're going to reduce outdoor storage losses. We're not storing these bales outside on the ground. They're all going to be wrapped in one way or another. We'll talk about those different ways of wrapping, but we can really get our storage losses down within 6% or less if made properly. It's going to be less expensive than a chopped silage system. All right, we can use the same equipment as if we were baling hay. We don't need a silage chopper. We don't need silage wagons. I don't need a blower or bagger. Still some plastic involved, but don't need all the iron to make high quality baleage. Why not make baleage? What are some barriers? Well, there is that risk of listeriosis as the primary pathogen in improperly made baleage or silage and or botulism. We'll focus a little bit more on the listeria piece here after a bit. How do we determine if we've made that bale at the correct moisture content? There's a couple ways of doing that. Handling and disposing of the plastic can certainly be a challenge. Will your local landfill take the plastic once you're done with it? What do we do with the plastic as a one-use product? Should we buy or rent wrapping equipment? There is a investment to be made, or do we hire a neighbor or hire somebody in the area to come custom wrap our bales? Do you have the equipment to handle and move the bales once they're wrapped? Now, if you're using an individual wrapper, that becomes a little bit more of a challenge. You know, got to have another piece of equipment. In terms of a squeeze, if we're inline wrapping those bales, we're not going to move them until it's time to feed them. And how can we feed this product and manage feed out and the amount of intake? So first off, before we go to make baleage, we really need to understand that fermentation process. And this is a basic silage fermentation curve where you see we have an aerobic, a lag, a fermentation, and a stable phase. We're going to, at the point where we wrap those bales, the goal is to exclude oxygen. And once we have oxygen excluded, that's really where the anaerobic phase takes off. We have those anaerobic bacteria utilizing the sugars, producing lactic acid, and then the pH drops and we get that bale into a stable phase. And we'll talk about feed out timing here in a few slides, but you see it does take some time in order to get baleage or silage to a stable phase. You know, if we're filling a bag of silage or making baleage and we wrap that and get into it within a week, 10 days, we really haven't met our goal of fermentation. Some characteristics of good fermentation. We really want a short aerobic phase to minimize the loss of plant sugars, minimize that respiration of the plant. We want to convert those sugars to lactic and acetic acid during that anaerobic phase and get that pH below 5.0. That's really important when we talk about managing pathogens. We want to get the temperature during fermentation not to exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit. All right, once we get that bale heated, we have binding of sugar and proteins and spoilage occurs. When we get into baleage at feed out time, it should have a pleasant smell, a sweet smell, you know, kind of like high quality corn silage to some extent. And we want to maximize bunk life. When we look at the fermentation process, comparing legume and grasses, as you look, you know, which fields can we make baleage on? What should you plant? If you're considering baleage, really that lactic acid is what's required to drive that pH down to produce a stable feedstuff via that desirable bacteria population. And it's all dependent on the amount of sugar in the plant. You know, the long and short of it is legumes have a lower sugar content than grasses, in addition to having a higher buffering capacity that resists the drop of that pH below 5. And if you hear it once during this presentation, you'll hear it probably 10 times. Moisture content is very important during the ensiling process in order to produce high quality forage. What's going to affect baleage quality? Those factors. One of them is going to be the maturity of the forage at the time of mowing. All right. We cannot improve fiber necessarily. And that's really the challenge. As forage becomes more mature, fiber content goes up, crude protein goes down, the ratio of stems to leaves increases. Really, we want to harvest our forage in that boot stage before we start to see that seed head if it's a grass forage, or pre-bud if we're talking about legumes. As fiber content increases, it makes it challenging to get good fermentation. Once again, proper baling moisture is top of the line important when making high quality baleage. You know, we want to be somewhere 45 to 60 up to possibly 65%, you know, kind of our sweet spots in that 50% range where we get good fermentation because we have plenty of moisture, plenty of plant sugars. Anything above 65%, we risk poor fermentation and increase the possibility for things such as botulism. Below 45%, we're kind of in that zone where oftentimes we intend to make dry hay. Of course, the weatherman's a habitual liar. We think we have 2, maybe 3 days to make dry hay. That gets cut in half or less, and we go ahead and wrap that hay. When it's really not dry, it's really not baleage, it's somewhere in between. And that's okay. We can preserve that forage, but we need to use more plastic. And we'll talk about plastic here going forward. Then, of course, anything less than 25, really ideally 15, 20% moisture is dry hay. So this talks about plant moisture versus time. This chart here in the bottom of the slide. And the take-home message is that plant continues to respirate after it's cut. And as that plant respirates, it's going to utilize the sugar and starches that it is stored. And that's going to continue to a relatively high level until we get forages below 60% moisture. Another slide showing how bale density affects the bunk life. Once we unwrap those bales and feed them, as we look at bale density versus hours to be spoiled. If we've got a variable chamber baler, especially one with a monitor, this is something that's a lot easier to adjust. If we're looking at a twine baler or perhaps a chain baler, making sure we get those bales dense enough can be a challenge. When we look at the time of wrapping, long story short is the sooner the better, but certainly within 24 hours. All right, as that bale remains exposed to oxygen, that respiration is going to continue. We start to have aerobic bacteria multiply, and the temperature of that bale internally increases. Once again, once we get that bale above 120 degrees Fahrenheit, that's when spoilage is going to occur. And we can pretty well prevent that if we wrap within a short time period. Once again, reduce respiration, keep the temperature lower. On a hot summer day, that bale should be wrapped ideally within 2 to 4 hours. A lot of times we'll wrap baleage, the same evening that it's baled, even if it's dark out. We feel that's best practice in order to produce the highest quality baleage, is to wrap after dark in a lot of cases. On a cooler day, we might have 8 to 12 hours to get that wrapping done. The longer we delay that wrapping, the increased chance for poorer fermentation due to a higher pH. We increase that possibility. Once again, we're going to eliminate oxygen from that bale environment, prevent the heating, and allow that fermentation process to start as soon as possible. At a bare minimum, we need 6 layers of 1 mil plastic, or 6 mils of plastic, plastic film, plastic wrap, in order to make high quality baleage and provide an environment for appropriate and adequate fermentation. There are times where we need more layers of plastic. As moisture decreases between that 25 and 45% moisture content, the recommendation is 8 to 10 layers of 1 mil plastic. As our forage maturity increases, as our stem ratio becomes higher, it just takes more plastic to prevent holes from being punctured through that plastic. Baleage cautions and potential red flags. Well, once again, let's reevaluate our goals. We want a pH of 5 or lower, lactic acid of 3% or higher, butyric acid at 0.1% or less. And if we have a high amount of butyric acid, those bales are going to smell rancid when we go to feed them. And then once again, ash content, soil, dirt contamination, less than 10%. And this all impacts our bunk life and the probability for clostridial toxins and listeriosis. When we look at soil and baleage, use ash content in a forage analysis as your best indicator. Most of our forage samples are going to range somewhere 6 to 8% ash. And it's not uncommon to add ash based on the conditions of a given field. But our goal is to keep that ash content under 10 to 11%. Situations that are going to result in high ash content, rain, flooded forages, aggressive raking, extremely dry conditions. Fields under these conditions probably are not the best candidates to make baleage in due to that contamination piece. And when we get soil and contamination, poor fermentation, we get some of those potential issues, such as surface mold. A white gray mold is typically harmless, but it can reduce performance of your livestock. Don't force animals to eat it. Oftentimes, if we put a big round bale out, they have the opportunity to pick through that and do some sorting. Whereas if we're feeding a TMR or a mixed ration, sorting those forages becomes a little bit more of a challenge. And that second potential issue is listeria, and listeria is not unique to baleage. It can be also found in silage, but the risk of listeria increases as the pH increases. So, one option is to go out and buy a cheap pH meter. A little bit on listeria, it's a cephalitis disease caused by the bacteria Listeria monocytogenes. It's found in soil, manure, rotten vegetation. Certainly, we don't want to wrap any hay that's got dead animals in it or feed any hay, that might have a snake or a deer fawn, some of those things in it. Unique thing about listeria is it thrives in cooler temperatures and anaerobic conditions that have a pH of 5.4 or above. So that's why we really emphasize that 5.0. Often called the circling disease. You can see the symptoms there. The animal leans to one side, it stumbles. There's some paralysis, some drooling. If we catch it early enough, there are some interventions with antibiotics that can be successful. But ultimately, with our sheep and small ruminants, the survival rate's only about 1 out of 4. Some risk factors for listeriosis, once again, is that limited fermentation, that pH above 5.0, any contamination, spoilage. Talk more about mold and the colors of mold here shortly. And then feeding too much baleage at one time. All right. And the important part there is, as we unwrap that baleage out of that plastic and we go to feed those bales, we've exposed that bale to air and to oxygen. So even if we've done a good job preventing spoilage during the preservation and fermentation phase, we've got to have good bunk management to prevent spoilage during feed out. We can evaluate baleage in a couple of different ways. One of those ways prior to baling or, right at baling is to use a moisture tester. They do operate within a window of error. There are also protocols out there to evaluate forage moisture, drying that forage in either the microwave. I really like the protocols out there for an air fryer, less risk of burning the forage when compared to a microwave. If we're going to use these products in the windrow prior to baling, we got to make sure we get a nice tight pack of forage to insert that probe into. Often, stuffing that forage into a PVC pipe if we're going to do it prior to baling. And as you can see here, some data from the University of Kentucky shows that one of those probes, consistently estimates moisture at 3.4% high. So keep in mind, your forage may be drier than what what a probe or a given tool says, or it could be wetter, depending. Some production practices. Ideally, regardless if we're making baleage or dry hay, the wider the swath we got, it will reduce drying time compared to a narrow swath. All right, think about that. As we spread that forage out immediately after mowing or conditioning, There is some benefit to that. Some correlation or good production practices when we look at making baleage. Some recommendations, once again, from Kentucky. Cut that forage early. We want to make uniform tight bales. We only want to mow what we can wrap in a given day. All right. We don't want those bales to set out for an extended period of time prior to wrapping. We want to have at least 6 layers of plastic. Make sure we maintain plastic integrity during storage. Some things that are unclear: mower type, whether it's a mower conditioner, hay bine, disc bine, those type of things. You know, typically a mower conditioner is going to promote drying over just a mower that doesn't have a conditioner. Baler type, rake type, do we or don't we need to use silage inoculant to make baleage? Those things are still a little bit unclear. Make good research projects in the area. Forage. Things to consider when we go to wrapping, and it really needs to be determined by what does your feed out rate need to be. You know, we have inline wrappers and individual wrappers. Some advantages of an inline wrapper: it's going to use less plastic, and you're going to wrap more bales per hour. 40 to 50 an hour versus 20 to 30 from an individual wrapper. If we're going to make inline tubes of bales, you know, the bales need to be uniform so they pack. All right, no different than making silage. The bales need to pack together and minimize airspace where we can have contamination, spoilage. Inline wrapper is going to require a higher feed out rate, ideally at least 2 bales a day. I can tell you on our farm, we do custom hire an inline wrapper for most of our round bales. With only 50 ewes in the flock, it's awful tough to feed 2 round bales a day. But we're not only feeding sheep. All right, we've also got a number of cattle on a farm at a given time. So that allows for that feed out rate, because once we remove one bale, we're exposing oxygen to the surface of the next. And so forth, and spoilage begins. Individual bales are going to work better for smaller livestock numbers. You know, in most of our sheep situations, depending on how many ewes or lambs we have running together, probably going to look at an individual bale wrapper if you're going to feed a lot of baleage. They're going to offer some more flexibility also in terms of storage and stacking, and there is some marketing potential for individual bales, so long as the plastic isn't damaged. Here's just a picture of that individual bale getting started on the wrapper. You know, the plastic savings on the inline wrapper is we don't have to wrap the ends. You know, plastic at $85 to $95 a roll, depending on when we order it in the haymaking season. We find a significant savings by not wrapping the ends. But once again, if you can't feed out of an inline wrapper, you can see the tubes here. At that higher rate, individual bales are going to be the best management option. Once again, here's just an inline wrapper. There's different makes and models. You can control the pressure, control the force as one bale butts up to the next. Having bales that are the same size is key. You know, if you got 2 balers running, or, you know, oftentimes the last bale that's baled smaller than the rest. My suggestion would be just go ahead and feed that bale, put it inside, or do something else with it, because the difference in size is going to allow for spoilage and mold potential. Other recommended practices, once again, if your forage is somewhere in that kind of 25 to 45% moisture range, we can preserve it in plastic. We're not going to achieve super great fermentation, but we can preserve it. We're going to look at more wraps of plastic to keep the air excluded, somewhere 8 to 10 wraps. And those are the bales we really need to feed first, the bales that don't have proper fermentation. Ideally, we don't want to handle bales other than to feed them. And this is primarily individual bales. Once they've been wrapped for 12 hours or more, you know, get them wrapped, get them placed where you're going to store them. and then let them sit until it's time to feed or potentially sell those bales. And then how we distribute our rows with an inline wrapper can play a role in terms of plastic degradation due to ultraviolet light exposure. Comes to storing and feeding bales. Do not store bales near woods or heavily trafficked livestock, or excuse me, not livestock, wildlife areas. The potential for livestock to poke holes and puncture the plastic. Maybe not as common with baleage as it would be corn silage, but it still happens. And keep your livestock out of them as well. High quality baleage is a desirable feedstuff, and your livestock, should they get in and around the bales, will puncture the plastic to get to that forage as well. Storing a well-drained, relatively smooth surface. I can tell you in terms of individual bales, they do float, and when they float, they do move if they're in an area that's prone to flooding. Check your plastic regularly. Should you find a hole in the plastic, go ahead and patch and repair. They do make a special kind of tape to repair baleage film. Round bales, a lot of times if we have dry hay, we do stack, that first layer of round bales on the flat end. I'm not going to suggest that you stack your high moisture bales just due to the overall weight and the potential for plastic degradation. Sunlight and moisture take their toll over time. Baleage feeding, full fermentation, that process, we kind of alluded to it earlier, takes a period of time, up to 6 to 8 weeks. We can reach a stable pH in as short as 4, but we don't want to go ahead and wrap a tube of hay or wrap some individual bales of baleage and get into it within 7 to 10 days. All right, we want to let that fermentation curve work its course. If we're in that, sweet spot, that 45 to 60, 40 to 60% moisture with our 6 wraps of plastic, where we've maintained plastic integrity, we can get up to 12 months of storage. Ideally, feeding within the first 9 months is preferred as that plastic begins to degrade. Our super wet baleage, where we have poor fermentation, should be fed in a much shorter window, as short as 3 months. And kind of that wet hay, semi baleage below that 40% moisture level with more wraps of plastic should be fed sooner as well, and as soon as 6 months after wrapping. Look at your baleage when it's time to feed it. All right, mold may be present. Mold can be an indicator of potential toxicities and harmfulness. We talked a little bit about white mold previously. Oftentimes it's not toxic. Typically doesn't cause respiratory issues. Livestock may or may not eat it, right? The molds that we should be concerned about are those that are green. I can't say I've ever seen blue mold in baleage, but I've certainly seen some red, and those indicate some issues. And more often than not, in an inline wrapper or a tube of inline wrap bales, it's those bales on the end where these mold issues occur. Best thing we've found to do with those moldy bales of different colors, if you're in eastern or southeastern Ohio, find a nice ravine to tuck them into away from your livestock due to the concern and potential risk for mycotoxins. All right, remember the bale for Mr. Lowers in 2019 there on the left. A little bit of white mold on the ends where maybe those bales weren't pressed together tightly enough. Ground was a little uneven. Typically happens at the top of the bale. Versus the bale here on the right, we see that kind of green, algae, slimy mold. That's a bale that needs to be tucked into that ravine somewhere. Throw it over the hill, disposed of however you see fit. But we shouldn't be feeding those bales to livestock, especially sheep and small ruminants. If it gets to the point where you're unsure if your baleage was made in the proper conditions, you had a compromising of the plastic, or you're just new to the process altogether, it's a good idea to have a fermentation test run on the forages after they've been stored. All right, go ahead, and once you run a fermentation test, we want to look at the percent dry matter. It should be, we should have 40 to 60% moisture. Our lactic acid should be greater than 3%. We want next to 0 butyric acid, and our pH should be lower than 5.0 as a way to minimize the risk for listeriosis in other pathogens. In terms of bunk life, when we go to feed baleage, once again, as soon as we expose those bales to oxygen, yeast and other organisms activate, and the spoilage cycle begins once again. In Penn State, they did a study on baleage density and monitored bunk life. They considered a bale spoiled and unfit after it was fed and reached a temperature 2 degrees warmer than the baseline temperature during storage. Generally, we want that baleage to be consumed within 2 days in cooler temperatures, and within 1 day when the temperature's warmer outside. And with that, I'll take any questions. Hopefully we addressed how to properly make baleage, how to properly store that product and manage feed out. And, like I said earlier, ultimately, when produced right and managed correctly, baleage can be a high quality feedstuff that we feed our sheep and other small ruminants. And with that, I'll take any questions. Thank you.